Just after 1 in the afternoon, on the 21st of October, 1805, a French marksman was lying in the rigging of a ship called the Redoutable, maybe 15 yards above the smoke, looking down onto the deck of the ship locked alongside his own. The two ships had drifted so close their rigging had tangled. He could see everything on that quarterdeck, and he could see one man in particular, a small man, moving among the others, because that man was wearing every decoration he owned. 4 stars of knighthood sewn onto the breast of his coat, catching what little light came through the smoke. The marksman aimed at the decorations. He fired, and the ball went in at the left shoulder of Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, passed through his lung, and lodged in his spine. Nelson dropped to his knees on the deck, where his own secretary had been killed an hour before, put his hand down into the blood, and fell onto his side. The captain of the ship reached him first. Nelson said, "Hardy, I do believe they have done it at last. My backbone is shot through." He was right. He had about 3 hours to live. And here is the part that almost nobody says out loud. At the moment he was shot, Nelson was winning the most complete naval victory in the age of sail. Before the sun went down, the combined fleets of France and Spain would be shattered, 22 ships taken or destroyed, thousands of men killed or captured, and not one British ship lost. The man who did that was dying on the deck while it happened, and the fleet he was destroying belonged to an invasion that had already been canceled 2 months before. This is the story of how 27 British ships wrecked a fleet of 33, why the admiral who planned it made sure he would be the most obvious target on the sea, and what that trade actually bought. If you want more naval history told this way, subscribing helps us keep making it. To understand Trafalgar, you have to start with a plan that had already failed. For 2 years, Napoleon had sat an army on the northern coast of France at Boulogne, staring across the Channel at England. Well over 100,000 men, barges to carry them, the whole apparatus of invasion. He had one problem, and it was the same problem every would-be invader of England has ever had. The Royal Navy was in the way. Napoleon's army could beat anyone in Europe on land. It could not swim. To get it across the Channel, he needed control of that water for just long enough to push the barges over. A day or two, maybe. And to get that, he needed to pull the British fleet out of position long enough to open a window. The plan he built to do it was enormously complicated. French fleets were scattered in ports along the coast, Toulon in the Mediterranean, Brest, Ferrol, Rochefort, each one watched by a British blockading squadron. The idea was to get them out, combine them, lead the British on a chase, and then double back to the Channel with overwhelming force at the one moment it mattered. The man given the hardest part of this plan was a French admiral named Pierre-Charles Villeneuve. Villeneuve was not a fool, and he was not a coward, whatever Napoleon later said about him. He was something worse for his own sake. He was a clear-eyed professional who could see exactly how good the British were and exactly how much of a gap stood between them and his own fleet, and who was ordered to bet everything anyway. His crews were the heart of the problem. The French Navy had been gutted by the Revolution. Many of its experienced officers had been aristocrats, and they had fled or been killed. Years of British blockade meant his ships sat in port instead of drilling at sea, and a crew that cannot go to sea cannot learn to fight there. The Spanish ships joining him were often superb. The largest warship in the world that day was Spanish, the Santísima Trinidad, with 136 guns on 4 decks. But the alliance was uneasy. The crews had never trained together, and many of the Spanish sailors were landsmen, pressed weeks before. Villeneuve knew all of this. He also knew what waited for him outside. Through the spring and summer of 1805, he actually ran the plan. He got out of Toulon. He crossed the Atlantic to the West Indies, drawing Nelson after him in a chase of thousands of miles. He came back, and off the coast of Spain in July, he ran into a British squadron and fought an inconclusive action, and his nerve, or his judgment, depending on how kind you want to be, told him the plan was breaking down. Instead of pushing north to the Channel, he turned south and put his fleet into the harbor at Cadiz. That decision ended Napoleon's invasion. Not a battle, a decision to go into port. Because when the news reached Napoleon that Villeneuve had gone to Cadiz instead of coming north, he did the arithmetic and gave up on the channel. On the 25th of August, 1805, the order went out. The army at Boulogne broke camp. The barges were abandoned. 160,000 men turned their backs on England and marched east toward Austria, where in a few weeks they would become the Grande Armée and win the most famous land campaign in French history at a place called Austerlitz. Hold on to that date. The 25th of August, because the Battle of Trafalgar was fought on the 21st of October, almost 2 months later. The invasion Trafalgar is supposed to have stopped had already been called off before the battle was ever fought. So why was it fought at all? The answer is one of the strangest things in naval history, and it comes down to one man's pride. Napoleon, disgusted with Villeneuve for running to Cadiz, decided to replace him. He sent out a new admiral, a man named Rosalie, to take command of the fleet. But, and this is very Napoleon, he did not tell Villeneuve he was being replaced. He just sent the replacement. Villeneuve found out anyway. Officers talk. In the middle of October, sitting in Cadiz with his combined fleet, he learned that Rosalie was already on his way to Madrid to take his command away from him. And Villeneuve could not stand it. To be relieved was one thing. To be relieved for cowardice, to have his successor arrive and find him hiding in port, that he would not accept. So he made a decision that every rational calculation told him was wrong. He would take the fleet to sea and fight before Rosalie could arrive to stop him. He knew Nelson was out there. He knew his crews were not ready. He wrote, in these weeks, like a man walking toward his own execution. He took the fleet out anyway to save his honor. 33 ships of the line sailed out of Cadiz to fight a battle that no longer had a strategic purpose, under an admiral who expected to lose, because that admiral could not bear to be thought a coward. Now let's talk about the man waiting for them. By October of 1805, Horatio Nelson was already the most famous fighting man in Britain, and he had assembled that fame out of pieces of his own body. He had lost the sight in one eye in Corsica. He had lost his right arm at Tenerife. He was small, often sick, seasick his whole life, and he was worshipped by the men who served under him in a way that is genuinely hard to find a parallel for. Part of it was that he won. At the Nile in 1798, he had caught the French fleet at anchor and annihilated it, stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. At Copenhagen, he had famously put his telescope to his blind eye, so he could honestly say he had not seen the signal ordering him to withdraw. And then he had won. But the deeper part of it was how he led. Nelson did not treat his captains as subordinates to be given orders. He treated them as partners to be trusted. He explained his thinking to them, ate with them, brought them inside his intentions, so that in the chaos of battle, when signals were invisible in the smoke and no admiral could control a fleet spread over miles, every captain would already know what Nelson wanted and could act without being told. He called them his band of brothers. It was not a slogan, it was a command philosophy, and it was decades ahead of its time. And in the days before Trafalgar, off Cadiz, he used it. He gathered his captains aboard his flagship, the Victory, and he laid out how they were going to fight. To understand why his plan was radical, you have to understand how sea battles were supposed to be fought in 1805. For over a century, the doctrine was the line of battle. 2 fleets would form up in 2 long parallel lines, sail alongside each other, and hammer away broadside to broadside until one side had had enough. It was orderly. It was controllable. And it was almost designed to be indecisive. Parallel lines could batter each other for hours and both drift away at the end, bloodied, with few ships actually taken. That is what most 18th century sea battles looked like. A lot of noise and not much result. Nelson had no interest in a battle like that. He did not want to push the enemy fleet away. He wanted to destroy it, to take or sink so many ships that it would cease to exist as a fighting force. And to do that, he was going to throw out the rule book. Instead of forming one line parallel to the enemy, Nelson would form his fleet into two columns and drive them straight at the enemy line, perpendicular like two spears aimed at the side of the Franco-Spanish formation. This was, on its face, dangerous to the point of recklessness. As his columns approached, the leading British ships would be sailing bow first into the enemy's broadsides, able to fire almost nothing back, taking punishment for long minutes before they arrived. Nelson accepted that, because if the columns broke through, if they cut the enemy line into three pieces, then the whole British fleet would be among the enemy in a swirling close-range brawl. Exactly the kind of fight the British gun crews, drilled by years at sea, were the best in the world at winning. He wrote the plan out in a memorandum on the 9th of October, and the language in it is not the language of a man hoping to win on points. He wrote of the destruction of the enemy. He wrote that no captain could do very wrong if he laid his ship alongside one of the enemy. He wanted annihilation, and he built a plan to get it. There was a cost built into the plan, and Nelson knew it, and he chose it anyway. The lead ships in each column would suffer the worst, and Nelson would lead one of those columns himself, in the Victory, at the front, in the most exposed position in the entire fleet. His officers begged him to let another ship lead, or at least to cover the stars on his coat. He would not. Some of it was fatalism. Some of it was the simple fact that leading from the front was the whole basis of the loyalty he commanded. He could not ask his captains to sail into that fire and watch from safety. He kept the decorations on. They would be the thing the marksmen aimed at. On the morning of the 21st of October, the two fleets found each other off Cape Trafalgar on the southwest coast of Spain. The wind was very light. That mattered enormously. It meant the British columns would crawl toward the enemy line at walking pace, maybe 3 miles an hour, fully visible, under fire, for the better part of an hour before they could strike. Every man in the lead ships could watch it coming. As the fleet went to battle stations, Nelson had a signal run up the Victory's masts. He had wanted it to read, "England confides that every man will do his duty." Confides, meaning trusts. His signal officer, a lieutenant named Pascoe, pointed out that confids would have to be spelled out letter by letter, while expex was a single flag in the codebook, much faster. Nelson said, "Make it so." And so the most famous signal in naval history, "England expects that every man will do his duty," exists in the exact words it does, partly because a junior officer wanted to save time on the flags. The men cheered as it went up, though at least one captain grumbled that Nelson knew perfectly well they would all do their duty, and he needn't have said so. Just before noon, the firing started. The lead ships took it exactly as Nelson had known they would. His own Victory sailed into the enemy line under a fire she could barely answer, men falling on her decks before she had fired a shot, her wheels shot away, her sails torn to rags. Collingwood, leading the other column in the Royal Sovereign, his ship freshly cleaned and the fastest in the fleet, so far ahead she went into the enemy alone, broke the line first and was surrounded. And then the British ships arrived among the enemy, and the plan came true. The line was cut. Line was. The orderly Franco-Spanish formation dissolved into exactly the thing Villeneuve had feared and could not prevent. 100 separate knife fights at a range of a few yards, ships locked together, guns firing into hulls at point-blank range. And at that game there was no contest. British crews could fire perhaps 3 broadsides to the enemy's 1. Years of drill against months in port. The difference was total. The Victory drove through the line and came up against the French Redoutable, and the two ships locked together, and it was from the rigging of the Redoutable, in that embrace, that the marksman found Nelson on his own quarterdeck. Nelson was carried below, through his own dying and wounded men, and he made them stop and attend to others first. Down in the dark of the cockpit, below the waterline, with the whole ship shaking around him from her own guns, he lay for 3 hours and asked again and again how the battle was going. They were able to tell him it was going the way he had designed it. The captain, Hardy, came down twice to report, and the second time he was able to tell Nelson that 14 or 15 enemy ships had been taken. Nelson said that was well, but he had bargained for 20. He knew what he had built. Even dying, he was keeping score against his own plan. His last coherent words are disputed, and this is worth being honest about, because it is the kind of thing the story usually smooths over. The traditional account, from the ship's surgeon and from Hardy, has Nelson asking Hardy to come close. "Kiss me, Hardy," which Hardy did, and then Nelson saying, "Thank God I have done my duty," and repeating it until he could not speak. A letter that surfaced much later claims different final words. The honest position is that the men who were actually in that cockpit recorded the traditional version, and that is the best evidence we have. He died at about 4:30 in the afternoon. The battle was already won. By the end of the day, the arithmetic was staggering, and it was exactly what Nelson had promised. Of the 33 Franco-Spanish ships that had sailed out of Cadiz, somewhere around 17 or 18 were captured outright, and one, the French Achille, blew up. Call it 22 ships lost as fighting units. The combined fleet lost several thousand men, killed and wounded, and many thousands more taken prisoner. The figures vary by source, but the killed alone run to well over 3,000. The British lost no ships at all. Around 450 men killed, some 1,200 wounded, and one of the dead was the commander. Villeneuve, the admiral who had sailed out to save his honor, was captured and survived. He was taken to England, treated with courtesy, and eventually allowed to return to France. In 1806, in a hotel room in Rennes, he was found dead with stab wounds to the chest. It was ruled a suicide. A man who had predicted his own defeat and lived through it and could not live with it. Now, what did Trafalgar actually buy? Here the honest answer and the legend diverge, and the honest answer is more interesting. The legend says Trafalgar saved Britain from invasion. It did not. The invasion had been called off 2 months earlier. On land, the war went on, and it went badly for Britain's allies. 6 weeks after Trafalgar, Napoleon destroyed the Austrian and Russian armies at Austerlitz, and Britain's coalition collapsed. Nelson's victory did not stop Napoleon. For another 10 years, Napoleon would dominate Europe. What Trafalgar bought was the sea. After that day, no one seriously challenged the Royal Navy for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, and in truth, for a century after. Britain could not beat Napoleon on land, but Napoleon could never touch Britain across the water, could never cut her trade, could never invade. The blockade held. The empire grew. The long, slow economic strangulation of Napoleonic France by British sea power became possible because the French Navy, after Trafalgar, effectively ceased to matter. It did not win the war in a day. It made a certain kind of losing impossible for Britain, permanently, and that turned out to be enough. And it cost the one man who could do that sort of thing. Nelson was 47. He was preserved in a cask of brandy and shipped home and buried in St. Paul's Cathedral under a dome, and the country went into a mourning that was genuinely strange in its depth. For a man most of them had never met, who had won a battle whose strategic necessity had already evaporated, and who had, in a sense, arranged his own death by refusing to take off his medals. He got the death he seems to have wanted. He said more than once that he expected to die in battle, and there is a case that some part of him welcomed it. What he left behind was a way of fighting. Trust your captains, aim for annihilation, accept the cost, lead from the front, that the Royal Navy would try to live up to for the next 100 years. The next one on this channel is the battle that came before all of this. The Nile, 1798, where Nelson caught a French fleet asleep at anchor and showed, for the first time, exactly what he meant by the word annihilation.